You were never meant to hear this. The parchment was burned, the bloodline erased, and every mention of their name scrubbed from the royal records. But the truth remains, buried beneath centuries of lies, sealed behind stone walls, and whispered through trembling lips of the dying. There was a family so feared, so cursed, that even the crown dared not speak their name. They were not banished, they were buried alive in history. And yet, their blood still pulses through corridors of power. Their rituals echo in secret chambers beneath England's finest estates. This is not folklore. This is the architecture of control, the original blueprint of dominance and decay. You've heard of kings and queens, dukes and barons, but behind them stood families not of nobility, but of necessity. Puppet masters cloaked in respectability. Men and women who fed on power, bred for obedience, and punished defiance not with exile, but with extinction. And it all began in the fog-drenched moors of northern England, where the Blackridge family reigned, not as lords of the land, but as keepers of something far darker. They weren't farmers. They weren't soldiers. They were the handlers of knowledge. Forbidden texts, ancient rites, and primal forces older than monarchy itself. Their estate, Blackridge Hall, no longer appears on maps. It was systematically removed, like a tumor from England's body. But the stone remains, underground, silent, intact. Locals still whisper of lights beneath the earth and voices that speak Latin backwards. Children who vanish near the ruins. A bell that tolls, though no one is seen. You see, the Blackridges practiced a tradition older than the church. The ritual of severed lineage, binding blood to power, loyalty to silence. Those who broke the code were erased, not just from life, but from memory. But every empire has its crack, and in 1724, something slipped through. A diary, a confession, a final warning from the last surviving daughter, locked in an attic, starved of light, language, and love. Her words were smuggled out by a priest who was later found crucified upside down inside a well. But the diary survived, and what it revealed was a reality too grotesque to ignore. A system of generational manipulation designed not to enslave, but to evolve the perfect predator. You were taught to believe history is a linear tale of progress. It is not. It's a spiral, and some spirals descend into madness, ready to step off the surface. Good? We're only just beginning. The deeper you go, the harder it is to climb back out. That's the cost of truth. It doesn't free you. It reshapes you. And once you know what lurks beneath England's velvet history, you'll never unsee it. Let's descend now into the year 1611, to the Hollowhurst estate, nestled in the wet stone hills of Devonshire. To outsiders, it was a place of charm, red brick, rose gardens, and a family whose portraits smiled down from cathedral walls. But none of those smiles were real. Every Hollowhurst child was born under ritual, named not by the parents, but by an inner circle of 12 robed figures who met in silence beneath the estate's east wing. Witnesses described their eyes as too still, their hands unnaturally cold. The naming wasn't about heritage. It was about spiritual ownership. These children didn't belong to a family. They belonged to something far older. The Hollowhursts had a secret tradition, the glass ceremony. At age 7, a child was led into a locked chamber, surrounded by mirrors etched with names of ancestors, and left alone. No food. No light, just their reflection, until they spoke the name that chose them. Some children never spoke. Those were never seen again. But the ones who did, they returned changed, quieter, colder, and completely obedient. Their reflections reportedly moved independently for several minutes after the door opened. There are sketches, and they will make your stomach twist. But here's where it becomes more than myth. In 1859, a builder doing unauthorized excavation beneath Hollowhurst discovered a secondary basement, one filled with coffin-sized wooden boxes, each marked with a different child's name. But inside, not bones, not bodies, just wax effigies, dressed in the family's clothing, with pins in the eyes and mouths sewn shut. Authorities dismissed it as theater. But what theater leaves behind the echo of children's screams, when no one is present? Psychologists today call it mass delusion. But what if it wasn't delusion? What if it was training? The Hollowhursts bred generations not for wealth, but for control. To infiltrate positions of power while appearing benign. Teachers, vicars, bankers, judges, all bearing the Hollowhurst seed, hidden in plain sight. This is how institutions are built, not by force, but by fear. By molding the minds before they ever ask questions. And now you have to ask yourself, who shaped yours? We're only 2 steps down. There are 18 more to go. And by the end, you won't know if you're looking in a mirror or through one. Power, true power, is never loud. It does not shout, it whispers. It slides through generations under different names, wearing new masks, passing old poisons like heirlooms. And no family embodied this more than the Millbanks of Lancashire. A name once spoken with reverence, now vanished without trace from every registry, every census, every photograph. But their signature remains in the minds of the broken. You've heard of behavioral conditioning. But what if a family didn't just study it? What if they perfected it? The Millbanks were not noble by blood. They were scholars, surgeons, and spiritualists, and in 1798 they founded a school on their estate. But this was no ordinary school. Enrollment was by invitation only. The children came from influential bloodlines, military, legal, ecclesiastical, promising sons, untouched daughters, and within 6 months of attendance, not a single one of them ever cried again. Reports, what few remain, spoke of smiling children with glassy eyes, compulsively obedient, incapable of expressing fear or dissent. One parent, a wealthy magistrate, returned early from a sea voyage and demanded to see his daughter. She greeted him, arms folded, and calmly recited her own eulogy. As if it had already happened, he pulled her from the estate immediately. She slit her own throat that night and bled out, never blinking. It took decades for whispers to become investigation. And by then, the estate was empty, classrooms abandoned mid-lesson, food rotting on plates. Every journal entry from faculty ended the same way. The mirrors are listening. And in the main hall, a massive mural, once hidden behind curtains, depicting children bowing to a black sun, their shadows dancing independently behind them. No artist ever signed it. No records of its creation exist, but it's not gone. The mural is in storage now, locked beneath the British Museum, catalogued as anonymous folk piece. That's how they hide it. They mock the macabre until you stop asking questions. Until you accept the discomfort as fiction. But this isn't fiction. The Millbanks didn't just disappear. They dissolved into the bloodstream of elite society. Became counselors, policymakers, institutional architects. They were never meant to be remembered, only obeyed. You may think you've avoided their reach. But ask yourself, why do you hesitate before speaking your mind? Why do you flinch at rebellion? Who taught you that silence is safer than truth? You already know the answer. You were conditioned. We all were. And the Millbanks wrote the manual. By now, you've noticed it, haven't you? That subtle pressure behind your eyes. The tightening in your chest. The part of you whispering, stop listening? That's not fear. That's programming resisting deletion. Because the next family didn't just manipulate the world. They restructured the human mind itself. Let me take you to Norfolk. Quiet, green, forgettable. That's not by accident. In the 1500s, Norfolk became a testbed for a family whose influence stretched beyond titles and thrones. They weren't barons or earls. They were something more insidious. Engineers of thought. The Itherlines. They built no castles, waged no wars. But they understood one principle that changed everything. Control the narrative, and you control the man. They weren't priests, but their word was gospel. They weren't royalty, but kings whispered for their counsel. The Itherlines invented the inversion method, a psychological technique so precise, so corrosive that it could rewrite memory, rewrite loyalty, even rewrite identity. Children brought into the family were exposed to hourly contradiction exercises. Pain is love. Obedience is freedom. The lie is the truth, spoken again and again until reality itself bent under repetition. And those who resisted, they weren't punished. They were isolated, not from others, from their own reflection. Mirrors were removed. Names were replaced with symbols. Language was stripped down to color, gesture, and breath. And once the child no longer recognized their former self, only then were they considered alive. In 1617, a visitor, a Jesuit defector named Father Marius, attempted to document the rituals. What he recorded chills the bones, even now children blindfolded, instructed to cut paper dolls and whisper secrets into their mouths. The dolls were then burned at dawn. By nightfall, the children had forgotten who they were. Marius fled. He was later found dead in a church, every bone in his body inverted. Spine where the ribs should be. Ribs where the skull once sat. Not mutilation, transformation. The Itherlines taught the crown, the church, and later, Parliament, how to erase resistance without a sword. How to shape behavior with suggestion. How to convert free men into willing sheep. Their methods were adapted, sanitized, rename it education, therapy, rehabilitation. But the essence remained. You were told conformity was safety. That emotion was weakness. That questioning was rebellion. Where do you think those ideas came from? Not the world. Not nature. They were planted. Carefully, repeatedly, lovingly. The Itherline way. And now I ask you, what have you accepted that never felt right? Because if you can't remember the moment you chose it, maybe you never did. Not every prison has bars. Some are stitched into your surname, some are hidden in your inheritance, and some you live inside without ever knowing who built the walls. Welcome to the lineage of the Hargraves. A family so elite, so untouchable, that even the monarchy walked softly around their name. But they didn't wear crowns. They didn't pose for paintings. The Hargraves ruled through omission, through selective absence, through whispers in corridors where decisions were made before the vote ever happened. Their estate, Gravenhold, was not marked on any map. Not then, not now, but if you comb through the oldest Masonic records, tucked deep within the London chapter archives, you'll find symbols drawn not with ink but with dried blood. A half-sun, a feathered key, and a locked door. Always sealed, always present, this was the Hargrave sigil. And it was stamped on every document that mattered: secret treaties, wartime amendments, psychiatric manuals, even early drafts of the British Penal Code. You see, the Hargraves specialized in one very specific kind of manipulation: institutional codification. Turning belief into law, thought into crime, doubt into sin. They engineered a system where silence became evidence, suffering became justice, and truth became sedition. And then they built the world around it. You ever wonder why certain crimes are punished severely while others, darker, older, are ignored? You ever feel like certain things are always just out of reach, hidden behind a wall of red tape, jargon, or bureaucratic fog? That's the Hargrave doctrine in action: not to rule, but to confuse. Not to punish, but to scatter. If a man can't find the center, he can't revolt. If he can't speak clearly, he can't resist. That's not chaos, that's design. In 1902, a journalist named Tobias Leamington uncovered Hargrave influence in 12 departments of the Crown. Everything from child welfare to psychiatric institutionalization. He published a single article, The Architects of Fog. By morning, his office was burned to the ground. By noon, his name was purged from the guild registry. By midnight, he was dead. No signs of struggle, just a single word carved into his chest, unsealed. Now, here's where the descent sharpens. The Hargraves didn't vanish, they evolved. Today, they move through international courts, research councils, education boards. They don't silence you. They simply remove your tools, language, reference, access, until your screams sound like static, and you wonder why you feel so tired, so disoriented, so numb. Because the Hargraves wrote the manual on how to erase revolt before it breathes. Still think your confusion is your fault? Or are you starting to see the fingerprints? Every institution that feeds you, heals you, educates you, and judges you once bowed to a single bloodline. Not out of loyalty, out of terror. The Rothmores of Kent weren't kings. They were calibrators of civilization itself. While the world obsessed over royal scandals and shifting borders, the Rothmores worked in silence, adjusting systems like a mechanic tunes an engine, medicine, morality, mortality. They didn't just study how people died. They decided when, how, and why. Let me tell you about the Coldwood facility. Built in 1764, funded by private interests, Coldwood was England's most secretive medical asylum. Never officially acknowledged. Not a single public record of its creation. It housed no criminals, only children, specifically children born during eclipses, storms, or planetary conjunctions, times considered astrologically, whom pure, by Rothmore doctrine. These children were said to be disruptive anomalies, prone to rebellion, defiance, insight. The Rothmores saw them as a threat and an opportunity. Within those stone walls, experimentation disguised itself as therapy. Children were placed in iron sensory chambers, no light, no sound, no movement, for days. Not to torture them, but to see how long it took for the self to fracture. Others were rewarded for repeating the lie over the truth. Those who lied most convincingly were given new names and new futures. They were released into society as educators, clergy, and mid-level officials. Seeds, carriers of controlled truth. One girl, Eleanor Birch, escaped at age 14. She wrote what became known as the Hollow Letters, a series of frantic, coded warnings describing what Coldwood really was, a soul reduction plant. Her descriptions match early CIA psychological warfare methods, decades before their time. Eleanor vanished weeks after the first letter reached print. But every page ended with the same phrase: "They are not curing us. They are editing us." That's what the Rothmores understood. You don't need to kill a man to erase him. You just need to alter the pattern of his perception. Dim the light until the darkness feels like home. Look around. Modern therapy tells you not to ask why, but to accept. Modern education punishes questioning as disruption. Modern medicine numbs before it inquires. These are not glitches. These are refinements. The Rothmore legacy is still alive, in language, in ethics, in the quiet compliance of billions. And here's the question they never want you to ask: what if your suffering isn't a symptom, but a signal? Because pain isn't always a curse. Sometimes, it's the last part of you that still knows you're human. There's a reason certain names are never spoken in public. Not because of shame, but because of power. The kind of power that doesn't just silence, it rewrites. The Bexley family was never noble, never royal, never recorded. But they didn't need status. They were the originators, the source, code of manipulation passed down through whispers and rituals that shaped entire societies without ever raising a sword. Their stronghold, a remote village in Yorkshire, now erased from modern maps. Its real name has been lost, replaced by coordinates blacked out in the Ordnance Survey archives. Locals once referred to it as the breathing ground. Not because of wind, but because the land itself pulsed beneath their feet. Visitors spoke of a hum, low, constant, unnatural, but the Bexleys didn't live above. They lived below. A complex of limestone chambers carved by hand. Generation after generation, each room aligned with celestial events and acoustic anomalies. The Bexleys believed words had weight. That language was not a tool, but a force. They trained their children in phonetic resonance, using tones that disoriented animals and shattered glass at precise frequencies. Their scribes developed reversal codices, books read only through reflection or when spoken backward, revealing truths that bypass the conscious mind. These weren't metaphors, they were psychological weapons. In 1823, an outsider, a young linguist named Arlen Cade, infiltrated the Bexley compound. What he discovered shattered him. In his journals, he writes of rooms that whisper back, mirrors that blink, and children who recited entire histories in languages they were never taught. Cade escaped barely, but was deemed clinically insane weeks later. Before his final institutionalization, he scrawled one last line onto a church wall in dried ink. The lie is the seed. The word is the blade. And we've been speaking our own spell. Now think? Why do you feel your energy drain when you speak the truth, but light up when you echo the narrative? Why does dissent feel heavy, but obedience feel like relief? The Bexleys embedded emotional resonance codes into our very language, turning words into cages. Turn on the news, listen closely. It's not information, it's enchantment. And we speak the spell ourselves day after day, believing it's thought. It's not. It's permission perception. Still think your thoughts are your own. You speak in a tongue forged by families who never wanted you aware, only functional. And once you realize that, you'll never say another word the same way again. You were taught that monsters don't exist, that evil wears a face, holds a weapon, leaves a trail. But the most dangerous evil leaves nothing, no wounds, no fingerprints, no trace, except for a change in your behavior you can't explain. This is where we meet the Witheringtons of Durham, a family that didn't conquer by domination, but by presence. They were the architects of emotional erosion, engineers of psychic entropy. The Witheringtons believed something most families feared, that the soul wasn't immortal, but programmable. That with the right environment, the right rituals, you could thin it, dilute it, until only a hollow shell remained, perfectly compliant, perfectly efficient, incapable of rebellion. They didn't build schools. They built absence chambers, stone rooms where time lost meaning, where identity leaked out slowly through repetition and sensory deprivation. These weren't dungeons. They were temples to surrender. What makes this so dangerous is that it didn't look sinister. The Witherington estate was pristine, trimmed hedges, immaculate halls, music always playing softly in the background, every surface polished, every smile polite. It looked normal. But beneath it, rituals were performed not with blood, but with neglect. Children were isolated for days, not to punish, but to induce detachment. Love was conditional. Words were never cruel, just absent. This wasn't abuse by aggression. It was abuse by omission, and it worked. By adulthood, Witherington offspring displayed signs of learned unreality, disassociation, flattening effect, refusal to form attachments, and an eerie capacity to follow orders without question. These were not children. These were vessels, and many of them were gifted into roles of power, not by force, but by invitation. They were perfect candidates, emotionless, articulate, incapable of empathy, ideal administrators, perfect judges, flawless enforcers of systems they didn't even believe in. In 1891, an internal memo from a royal advisory board referred to a Witherington descendant as irreplaceable asset, pure of motive, void of self. That memo was signed with 3 symbols, a downward triangle, a blank circle, and an eye without a pupil. The same symbols later found etched into psychiatric wards across the country. This is what they've done. They've replaced passion with protocol, rebellion with regulation, identity with function. And most men walk through life like echoes, never asking, "What part of me chose this?" Now I ask you, when was the last time you felt fully alive, unfiltered, defiant? If you can't remember, you've already been touched by the Witherington legacy. And if you're still here, still feeling this descent, then comment below, "I remember the mirror, I remember the mirror." Say it twice. Not for the algorithm, but for yourself. Lock in the fracture. Welcome the awakening. By now you feel it. The itch behind the mind, the shadow in your chest that wasn't there before. That's not fear. That's your original self stirring. Because the deeper we go, the closer we get to the truth they buried beneath centuries of soot, scripture, and silence. The next family didn't just influence England's fate, they redefined reality itself. Enter the Halworths, a bloodline woven into the foundations of Britain's geological, architectural, and ritualistic evolution. Unlike other families who operated in hidden chambers and private estates, the Halworths embedded their power into the very ground beneath England's most sacred spaces. Cathedrals, courthouses, Parliament itself, their knowledge wasn't stolen. It was inherited. From a tradition even the Druids feared the geometry of dominion. You were taught that architecture is function. That stone is stone, but the Halworths knew otherwise. They mastered the dark alchemy of spatial resonance, that angles, ratios, materials, and symbols placed in exact configurations could affect not just mood, but consciousness. They built floor plans that dulled resistance, ceilings that induced obedience, doorways that distorted memory. This wasn't theory, this was science inherited from Babylon, preserved in blood and disguised as culture. In 1738, a French mathematician named Émile Fournier visited Salisbury Cathedral to study its acoustics. What he discovered haunted him for life, whispered Latin phrases, embedded in the echoes, that shouldn't exist. He claimed the architecture, spoke back, repeating sermons never delivered by mortal priests. Fournier returned to France and reportedly tried to burn out his ears with boiling wine. His last words were scribbled on a page and buried by his own hand, "The angles bend the will." The Halworths weren't just builders. They were wardens of perception. Every royal coronation passed beneath arches designed by them. Every parliamentary chamber sits atop ley lines they mapped. Every British court still follows symbolic gestures. Hand motions, standing rituals, drawn from Halworthian cipher, books once declared heretical in 1452. And you thought it was just tradition. When you walk through an ancient building and suddenly forget what you were thinking, that's not fatigue. That's interference. When you feel peace in one chapel and dread in another, that's not spirituality. That's programming. The Halworths made architecture into a cage the soul couldn't see. And what if I told you your workplace, your school, your courtroom, all of them use descendant blueprints? You've been inside a Halworth construct your entire life. You didn't grow up free. You grew up angled. And the walls were whispering the whole time, "You're halfway down now. The point of no return." And if you felt that flicker, that unraveling thread of everything you thought was true, then good. That's the first sign of awakening. The next family, they didn't haunt England with ghosts. They haunted it with structure. Invisible chains of logic that bind even the freest mind. The Aldcrofts weren't just sinister. They were systemic. The Aldcroft dynasty rose in the 1500s, not through war or gold, but through measurement. They were surveyors, timekeepers, early statisticians. And what did they measure? Not land, not wealth, men. Behavior, belief, deviation. They pioneered the first moral inventories, mapping entire communities. Who drank too much, who spoke too loudly, who asked too many questions. These charts were shared with clergy, military officers, and city councils. And just like that, nonconformity became trackable. But here's where it gets darker. The Aldcrofts believed in sacred arithmetic. The idea that every soul could be reduced to numbers, and every deviation predicted. They authored the 7 ratios of obedience. A hidden doctrine used to engineer compliance through pressure points, shame, hunger, sleep, light, rhythm, repetition, and perceived autonomy. They understood that you don't need whips or prisons if you can predict behavior and preempt rebellion. In 1812, one of their private ledgers was uncovered by a coal worker near Manchester. It detailed experiments on orphan boys aged 8 to 14. Each child was assigned a numerical profile. When their ratios dipped below the threshold of resistance, they were granted minor privileges. A slice of bread, a warm blanket, a word of praise. Not love, design. Rewards calibrated to reinforce total dependency on the system. Those boys, many became constables, judges, principals, bureaucrats, each one primed to enforce order not from cruelty but from conditioning. Modern society calls this behavioral economics. cognitive framing, habit loops. The Aldcrofts called it purity math. And here's what they learned: if you give a man just enough comfort, he won't ask where the chains are. He'll thank you for them. He'll polish them. He'll pass them to his children. You've lived in this system. Every form you fill, every rule you follow, every choice you're given is the result of tracked deviation. You are not lost. You are accounted for. This is where men break, or become something else entirely. The descent continues. And now that you're halfway through this descent into forbidden knowledge, comment below. The cage is measured. The door is mine. Comment it twice. Claim it. Not for views. For yourself, to remind the system you see it now. Most men fear monsters with fangs and claws. But the true predators, they sit behind desks. They drink from porcelain, and they never raise their voice. The Graftons of Sussex knew this well. A lineage so elegant, so charming, that no one noticed when they rewrote the ethics of suffering. They weren't soldiers. They weren't priests. They were custodians of guilt. Their weapon wasn't violence. It was virtue. From the 17th century onward, the Graftons positioned themselves as moral authorities, philosophers, judges, doctors of the soul. But behind their angelic facade lay a grim calculus. A belief that true control could only be maintained through the illusion of righteousness. Make men believe they deserve their suffering, and you never need to raise a whip again. Their estate, Viremore Hall, was known for its gardens and for its silence. Servants were forbidden to speak unless spoken to. Children were required to confess nightly, not sins but thoughts, private ones, wandering ones, human ones, and if they confessed a forbidden idea, curiosity, defiance, lust, rage, they were taken to the echo room. The echo room contained no instruments, no fire, no chains, just a single chair and a full-length mirror. The child sat alone while a Grafton elder stood behind them and whispered one sentence for an hour straight. What you are is wrong. Over time, the mirror did what punishment could not. It implanted self-disgust. It hollowed them, made them hate their instincts. Soon, the children began confessing before they'd even acted. They learned to betray themselves in advance, preemptively obedient, self-correcting, perfect. You recognize this, don't you? Modern men call it anxiety, imposter syndrome, depression. But scratch the surface and you'll find the same Grafton formula. You are wrong. Not because of your actions, but because of your thoughts. You've been trained to distrust your own mind, to police your own desires, and to seek external approval for internal peace. That's not mental health, that's control. The Graftons embedded themselves into institutions of morality, church councils, medical boards, educational commissions. They taught the world to moralize misery, to exalt suffering as growth, to cast pleasure as sin. They didn't need to lock you up. They just made you ashamed of your own hunger. And now I ask you, how much of your life have you spent apologizing for who you are? How much longer will you keep confessing, when the crime was never real? You were taught that evil announces itself, that you'll hear it coming, see it in the eyes, feel it in the room. But what if evil was calm, charming, generous? What if it brought you bread, tucked you in, told you everything would be okay? The Dunleavys of Somerset perfected this illusion, the art of benevolent control, and no family haunts England's history more quietly or more effectively. The Dunleavys didn't conquer, they comforted. While other families wielded fear, the Dunleavys mastered dependency. They posed as philanthropists, caretakers of orphans, benefactors of widows, patrons of the arts. Their name was spoken with reverence by the poor and elite alike, but behind their generosity was a darker purpose to replace the concept of freedom with gratitude. In 1776, they established the Dunleavy Home for Displaced Youth. It was hailed as revolutionary: clean beds, warm meals, patient tutors. But inside, the children were monitored day and night. Every act of kindness was tracked, every bite of bread earned, and every act of defiance punished not with pain, but with withdrawal, silence, coldness, averted eyes. The children weren't hurt, they were starved of approval, and slowly, they began to trade authenticity for affection. They learned be what they want, or be alone. By age 10, most of them could recite the phrase etched above the main hall in perfect Latin, Gratius ego, ergo sum, I give thanks, therefore I am. To the outside world, these were miracles of rehabilitation, perfect, obedient children sent to serve as pages, assistants, interns in homes of influence across England. But what they really were vessels of suppression. Their presence in elite households created atmospheres of docility, reverence, unnatural calm. Conversations died in their wake. Questions dissolved. The children didn't speak out. They didn't need to. Their existence was a signal: this is what happens when you surrender early. And where are the Dunleavys now? Gone, on paper. But their doctrine lives in every modern bureaucracy that rewards loyalty over truth, compliance over courage, politeness over principle. It lives in every workplace where dissent gets iced out quietly. In every school where curiosity is mistaken for disruption. In every relationship where love is withheld like a ration. You don't fear them because they don't hit you. They nurture you, and that's the real prison. Because when comfort becomes currency, truth becomes treason. So ask yourself, are you free? Or just well-behaved? Some families built walls. Others built churches. But the Grendels of Blackmoor built nothing you could see. Only what you could feel. They were not architects of stone or steel. They were weavers of atmosphere, curators of invisible pressure, and once you walked through their threshold, you'd never breathe the same air again. Blackmoor was no village. It was a psychological labyrinth, an unmarked territory in the Devon countryside where compasses failed and birds refused to nest. The land was damp year-round, the trees never quite straight, and the sky always one shade darker than the weather suggested. The Grendels chose this place not by chance, but by design. They believed that geography could serve as emotional architecture. That land itself could be tuned to alter the soul. Inside their manor, every hallway was built to a scale just slightly off, not enough to notice, but enough to induce unease. Ceilings sloped subtly, doors were set an inch too low. Windows allowed light that bent the edges of perception. Guests reported feeling smaller after staying the night. Some felt watched. Others described hearing music just below the threshold of hearing, strings vibrating through stone. One guest claimed he heard his name whispered from inside the walls. His wife insisted the walls were breathing. But it wasn't the house that changed people. It was the Grendels themselves. They were masters of empathic inversion, the ability to mirror others so perfectly that their victims felt exposed, drained, manipulated without ever realizing it. They didn't threaten, they didn't persuade. They simply reflected you back slightly wrong, a facial expression too perfect, a silence held too long, a kindness that made your stomach twist. They tuned themselves like instruments, each emotion they displayed, carefully calculated to extract submission. Over time, visitors lost confidence, lost voice, lost certainty. They second-guessed every decision, every thought, every memory. They left the estate unsure if they were leaving at all, or just stepping into a deeper corridor of themselves. One wrote in his final letter, "I don't know if I was manipulated, or if they simply showed me what I've always been." This is the true mastery of the Grendels. They didn't change you. They convinced you that you'd always been this way. And when you left, you brought their ghost with you, inside your self-image. Ever wonder why you apologize for things you've never done wrong? Look closer. The Grendels never touched your body, they adjusted your reflection. Some men build empires. Others erase them. The heroics of Suffolk specialized in the latter, but not by war, not by fire, not by sword. They erased memory, family trees, historical facts, people, not through violence but through a science far older than psychology, a craft hidden in the creases of parchment, the cadence of oaths, and the placement of silence. Every age has its myth of the forgetting. But what if it was never a myth? The heroics didn't just own land. They owned narrative control. A lineage of scholars, scribes, bishops, and court advisors, they were always adjacent to the throne, never on it. Close enough to whisper into kings' ears, but never close enough to be seen bleeding when the dagger came. They advised monarchs on treaties, rewrote legal texts, edited royal chronicles. Their family motto, nullum verum nisi redactum, no truth but what is edited. In 1634, a scandal nearly broke them. A surviving ledger from an excommunicated monk detailed how 3 entire villages were struck from record by heroic decree. Every baptismal record, every grave marker, every tax document burned, scrubbed, or rewritten. Why? Because those villages refused to adopt a royal oath. One rewritten by the heroics, laced with language that would bind generations to servitude through semantic traps. Not legal contracts, linguistic curses. And here's the part that makes your blood freeze when researchers in the 20th century attempted to excavate one of the erased village sites. They found something chilling. No artifacts, no remains, no coins, but one sealed book wrapped in ash cloth. Its pages were blank until they were held to flame. Then, only a single sentence appeared. That which is named, lives. That which is unnamed, vanishes. The heroics understood something our modern minds still can't grasp. That memory is not stored only in the brain, but in external structures we assume are permanent: language, record, repetition. Control those, and you control not just history, but identity. You erase not the body, but the meaning of that body. So the next time you find a strange gap in historical accounts, a missing year, a vanished name, a church with no founder, ask yourself, was it ever real? Or did someone make you forget? The heroics didn't erase people. They erased your permission to remember. Truth is never lost, it is buried. And the deeper it's buried, the more dangerous it becomes to unearth. Enter the Ashcombe estate, a sprawling manor house tucked into the Wiltshire countryside, draped in ivy and centuries of silence. But beneath its gardens, past the cellar doors and behind a false stone wall, lies something far older than any ledger, any bloodline, any man. The Room of 13 Mouths. Discovered in 1827 by a skeptical antiquarian named Erasmus Greer, this hidden chamber was sealed tight with iron locks, etched in Latin phrases, not prayers, warnings. It took Greer weeks to get inside, but what he found wasn't treasure, it wasn't gold, it was a room alive with voices, no human occupants. Just 13 carved wooden effigies, disfigured, eyeless, open-mouthed, each staring toward the center of the room. And in the center, a single obsidian mirror, one that didn't reflect Erasmus's image. Instead, it showed other people, other faces, all of them screaming in silence. Some were ancient, some modern. Some looked like him. Greer wrote in his journal that when he spoke aloud in that room, the mouths of the effigies moved. They answered in riddles, half-truths, fragments of prophecy. Truth comes not in books, one said, but in the echoes of things forbidden to be spoken. Here's the truth they didn't want Erasmus to uncover. The Ashcombes were not a political family. They were a custodial one. Their purpose wasn't to rule, but to guard, to trap knowledge too volatile to be trusted with kings or commoners. Secrets of pre-Christian ritual, forgotten names of entities once worshipped openly, instructions encoded in geometry and sound for manipulating the human psyche without permission. The Room of 13 Mouths was their vault, their prison, their altar. When Erasmus tried to publish his findings, he was declared insane, committed to the Brighton Asylum, where he died 11 months later, writing one final phrase over and over on the walls of his padded cell. But they heard me anyway. The estate has since been sealed. Government property. Off limits. The official reason? Unstable foundation? But the locals know. They hear things from under the soil on windless nights. Whispers and 13 voices. Questions no one wants answered. Because some secrets don't just haunt you. They consume you if you listen long enough. The mind is not your own. Not entirely. From birth you're fed a script, not just by schools, by parents, by clergy, but by something older, something that predates religion, predates the state, an architecture of thought handed down through symbols, rituals, and fear. And in 1893, a forgotten noble family, the Winthorpes of Northumberland, tried to rewrite that architecture, not for freedom but for control. The Winthorpes were never prominent in politics, never sat in parliament, yet they had wealth beyond measure. Why? Because they didn't chase power. They engineered it, quietly, from the shadows. For nearly 200 years, they ran an institution known only in coded diaries as the Mindhall, a subterranean complex hidden beneath their ancestral home, filled with chambers designed not to imprison people, but to break and rebuild them, not with whips, not with chains, with language. Inside Mindhall, the Winthorpes experimented with what they called ritual linguistics, an occult science merging phonetics, trauma, and neurobiology. Subjects were exposed to patterns of sound, spoken phrases, rhythmic chants, even coded lullabies, specifically crafted to dismantle free will, to overwrite memory, to insert new beliefs so deeply that the subject believed they had always held them. Sound familiar? Decades later, the CIA would fund MK Ultra. The Soviets would develop Zersetzung. But the Winthorpes had been doing it centuries earlier, and more precisely. They claimed they could turn any man into a martyr, a killer, or a prophet in 47 hours or less without laying a single hand on him. Just with words. And here's the sickest part. They didn't see it as evil. They saw it as refinement. They believed the human mind was a crude, chaotic organ that needed to be tuned, like a piano, for higher resonance. They believed obedience wasn't oppression, but ascension. They weren't torturing people. They were elevating them. By 1911, the Mindhall was shut down after a fire destroyed most of the estate. But fire doesn't destroy ideas. The journals were salvaged, passed along, studied in elite linguistic circles. Some say elements of Winthorpian ritual speech are now embedded in modern political rhetoric, advertising, religion, even music. Ask yourself this: when was the last time you had a thought that wasn't already waiting for you? You think you're immune, that you're free. But there's a voice in your head that doesn't belong to you. And it's been there for generations. They called her the White Widow. But she had no name in official records, No birth certificate, no grave. Only whispers, dark ones, trailing back to the village of Gresford in the Welsh Marches, where in the late 1700s 7 children vanished from their homes over a span of 3 years. No struggle. No signs of forced entry. Just empty cribs and a pale feather left on each sill. Locals spoke of a woman who lived in the hollow woods, where the sunlight never seemed to land. She was seen only at dusk. A white bonnet, a black shawl, and no footprints where she walked. The elders warned children not to sing certain nursery rhymes near the trees. They claimed the melody would call her. That she didn't just take children, she rewrote them, molded them, turned them into something else. In 1812, a noble family, the Braithwaites, purchased the Gresford estate. Their youngest son, Thomas, went missing 3 weeks after the move. And just like the others, no doors were broken, no windows disturbed. Only a white feather. This time, the father, Lord Reginald Braithwaite, didn't turn to the village constable. He turned to a secret fraternity within Oxford University, one known for dabbling in ancient Anglo-Saxon demonology. What they uncovered was chilling. The White Widow wasn't just a ghost. She was a living remnant of the Sather, a pre-Christian Norse cult that had migrated south, blending with British Druidic bloodlines. Women chosen from these bloodlines were trained to master the veil, a psychological realm between waking and dreaming. There, they could reshape perception, implant memories, and erase identities, not through violence but through ritual. It said the widow chose children not for malice, but because they were blank tablets, easily rewritten, easily shaped. The 7 who vanished. Some believe they reappeared years later under different names, adopted into aristocratic families, placed in positions of influence. Their original memories, their true selves, forever erased. What if I told you this practice never stopped? What if governments today have perfected it? Every time you see a tragic backstory followed by a sudden rise to fame, a troubled youth, turned national icon, a man who vanishes, then returns changed. Different eyes, different voice. Maybe it's not inspiration. Maybe it's reprogramming. Maybe the White Widow never left. She just wears a suit now and works for the crown. There's a manor deep in the Northumberland countryside that doesn't appear on any modern map. Locals only speak of it in code. The Iron Garden. An estate built of blackened stone and wrought iron gates, swallowed by ivy and mist. But within its walls, a family once lived whose name was forbidden to be uttered in public after 1891. The Dunharrows. The Dunharrows weren't royalty. They didn't need to be. Power doesn't always wear a crown. Sometimes it wears silence. For 3 generations they were never photographed, never attended church, never voted. And yet land was signed over to them by dukes. Laws were changed with just their whispered suggestion. A visiting American journalist once wrote, "They are not part of England. They are what England hides under its skin." The Dunharrow patriarch, Lord Cadell, had a peculiar obsession, the engineering of perfect obedience. Not in soldiers, in children. Records unearthed from defunct psychiatric hospitals in the 1970s reveal that Cadell ran experiments on his own lineage. Not torture, not cruelty in the traditional sense, but a psychological construction site built inside the developing mind. Isolation tanks. Sleep deprivation mixed with lullabies, controlled reward systems, exposure to death and joy in sequence, until the child's identity cracked and Cadell inserted something else in the gap. One of the boys, Elias Dunharrow, escaped at 14. His diary was recovered decades later. In it, he described rituals in the Iron Garden circle formations of children, repeating lines in Latin while holding hands under moonless skies. "We were taught that names are cages," he wrote. "We were stripped of ours, and given new ones. Ones that could only be spoken inside the manor." The strange part, years later, Elias was spotted at a UN psychological warfare summit under a different name. He was a behavioral architect working with NATO, designing cognitive reinforcement loops, systems that condition populations to believe false narratives by overexposure and emotional oscillation. Coincidence? Or had he never truly escaped the Iron Garden? What if the children weren't the victims, but the prototypes? What if we are the next test? You think your thoughts are your own. You think your opinions came from struggle and wisdom? No, they were planted, nurtured, and harvested, just like in the Dunharrow experiments, and the soil they used was fear. By now, you've likely felt it, the shift. That sensation crawling under your skin, whispering that the world you thought you knew was a carefully drawn illusion. That history isn't a story of progress, but of engineered forgetting. And in the heart of England's cobbled streets, behind its ivy-draped estates and manicured hedgerows, the bloodlines that authored this deception are still alive, still watching, Still pulling strings with velvet gloves, let's talk about the Marwick line. Buried in a now classified investigation from 1949, spearheaded by a rogue unit within British intelligence, were documents revealing that 5 aristocratic families had pooled resources during the Victorian era to create what they called the cognitive citadel. Not a place, a system, a hidden framework designed to contain awareness itself. Using mass education reforms, manufactured ideologies, controlled press, and controlled opposition, they engineered how people would think. Not what, but how? That's more dangerous. The Marwicks were the nucleus, bankers, architects, but also deeply embedded in mystic traditions. They were known for their obsession with cerebral frequencies, the belief that emotions, collective moods, and even belief systems could be induced through environmental design. They had churches built at calculated angles to disrupt attention spans. They pushed for specific dyes in children's school uniforms, believing the color would inhibit rebellious neural activity. Their control was not physical, it was symbolic, ambient, invisible, and yet their own downfall began from within. In 1912, Sophia Marwick, the eldest daughter, broke the chain. She left the estate under the cover of fog and wrote what is now known as the Indigo Confession, a handwritten testimony mailed to 7 foreign journalists before she disappeared. In it, she described the Citadel's ultimate goal, a world without unapproved memory, a world where man forgets his birthright, that his mind is sovereign. And that's the war they've been fighting ever since. Not over land, not over oil, over attention, your attention. Because if they can control that, if they can keep you distracted, angry, entertained, tribal, divided, they never have to fear a reckoning. So if you're still watching, you're already resisting. You're not just absorbing this, you're remembering. Now listen closely to prove you're not who they designed you to be. Comment the phrase, "The sovereign mind awakens," twice, not just for the algorithm, but for yourself, to mark the moment you stepped out of the illusion and into war. This is where we end, or rather, where your descent completes its first cycle. Because once you've heard these stories, once you've stared into the abyss of England's haunted bloodlines, you cannot return to comfort. You can't know what's been revealed. You now understand that the so-called elites didn't just inherit land and wealth, they inherited roles. Roles within a centuries-old machinery of control. They are not just families, they are institutions in disguise. They've worn crowns soaked in shadow, sat in parliaments laced with oath-bound silence, donned robes behind college gates where rituals took place that were never meant to be witnessed by outsiders. They'd birthed kingdoms, burned truths, and buried secrets beneath chapels, castles, and even family names. Every crest hides a cipher, every motto masks a code, and they still haunt the present. They do not need ghosts. They are the ghosts, spectral forces that whisper in boardrooms, manipulate from behind philanthropic fronts, and educate the masses into servitude under the name of enlightenment. But the joke now is this: they trained us too well. They taught us to read, to dig, to question. And now that some of us are truly awake, the institutions can feel it, like a tremor rising through the crust of a system that's run too long on silence. The families, the orders, the veiled houses, they fear you. Not because you'll riot, but because you'll remember. Because you'll look past the narrative, trace the symbols, follow the suppressed truths, and then share them. That's how their darkness ends. Not with noise, but with awareness. With you passing this to the next man who needs to hear it. So as this video closes, know this: you were never meant to see behind the curtain. But now that you have, don't stop, don't scroll, don't return to the simulation. Instead, investigate your bloodline. Study the symbols around your city. Look at the architecture, the names of your schools, your banks, your churches. Patterns are never accidents. Truth was never meant to be convenient. And power belongs to those who dare to see. You've just walked through 4 hours of forbidden history. And in doing so, you've crossed a threshold that makes you dangerous. Now the question is, what will you do with what you now know? Because history isn't dead, it's just well dressed, and it's watching.